Okay everyone, so let's start working on our diffuse. So as you can see, I have already created a PSD file that we're going to use. And what I essentially did is I copied the blockout file and I put all of those layers into one Photoshop group. So they're all here. Now in this group, I've got the AO, sharp and broad and cavity maps that we made in the previous chapter. I put them into the lightning group. So this will give us a good starting point for creating our texture. And now we can start adding some basic colors to it. So what I'm gonna do is I'll disable this lightning group and I'll create a new layer below it. Okay. Now let's go and let's fill this layer with some kind of light gray color. This will be maybe some kind of a painted metal that we'll use for the whole door. So I'll go and choose some kind of a color, maybe something like this, and I'll fill the canvas. Now below this layer I'm going to create another one, but I'll fill this one with some kind of a dark gray color. This will be the color of the base metal underneath the paint. So later on when we start adding the details, we can create a mask for this gray layer and it will allow us to uncover the metal underneath it. Okay, so we've got those two basic colors, but what we need now are some colors for those smaller elements like handles and glass and so on. Okay, so I'm gonna go and open the blockout group and I'll go and select the door handles layer and I'll move it to the top. Okay, and now I think I'm gonna leave the color like this because I kind of like how it's slightly lighter than the background. We can always change it later if we don't like it. And now I'm gonna go and also find the Windows frames layer and I'll also move it to the top. Okay, now I'll go and select the color picker tool and I'll make sure that both of them are the same color, so I'll just go and fill it in. And now I'll go and merge the two layers together. Okay. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to keep all elements that share the same kind of material on one layer. So for instance, I want those Windows frames and door handles to be made up of maybe some kind of brushed metal, as opposed to the gray paint of the door panels and the frames and so on. Okay, now let's also go and let's give some unique color to the glass. So what I'm gonna do is I'll go and select our door Windows glass and glass top layers, and I'll also move them to the top. But now, when I go and enable the lighting layer, you will see that the size of the windows doesn't really match anymore. And that's because we have played around with the size of the trims a little bit during the normal mapping process. Things like that happen quite often when you experiment with the size of the details and you start adding more of them. So we have to be prepared to make some changes to your blockout later on. But in this case we can do that very, very easily. So what I'm going to do is I'll go and move those layers above the lightning group. And now I'll go and make a selection from the glass top layer. Now let's zoom in. Let's disable this layer. And I'll simply go and modify the selection again. I'll use the contract. And I'll simply use something like maybe 8 pixels. And that actually seems to work quite well. Maybe let's make it a bit smaller, maybe by 1 pixel. Okay, now I'll simply go make a mask from this layer and click Apply Layer Mask. Now before we move on to the next step, I'll go and do the same thing with the other glass layer, and then we'll merge those two glass layers together. Okay, so now we've got almost all layers that we need, but before we finish, I think I'll go and maybe add some painted red strips to our door, and that will basically add some more interest to our texture. So I'll go and make a new layer, and now maybe let's go and let's add a red strip that will be painted across the door panels. So let's go and let's make a selection, like this. Okay, now I'll go and fill this with a bright red color. Maybe let's use something like this. Okay. Now let's also make this top metal trim painted with red as well. So I'll enable the grids. I will go and enable the lightning group. And I'll go and make a selection like this. Now let's hide it again and let's fill this selection with a red color. Okay. Now we don't really want those red strips to be painted on the frames, so I'll go and remove those bits. So I'll go enable this group, and I'll simply go and make a selection here, and then one on the opposite side. Okay, now let's simply click delete. Now let's disable the grids, and we've got our basic colors down. Okay, so now before we move on to the next step, I'll skip ahead and give those layers proper names. Right, so now that we've got our basic colors, let's go and let's add some lighting. So let's enable our lighting group, and now I'll go and disable the cavity map and AO broad, and I'll set the AO sharp to multiply. Now, as you can see, this darkness I will hold texture. So what I'm going to do is I'll go to Image, Adjustments, and I'll adjust the brightness contrast. I'll go and increase it maybe something like this. And when I go and change the blending mode of this layer back to normal, you will see that those gray areas become almost white. So for your AO sharp layer, you want to have something like this. Okay, now let's also go and let's put the AO broad map to multiply as well. And when I go and do that, you will see that the result looks quite fake by default. We've got those very colorful highlights here and there. We've got some blue highlights on the bottom and also some yellowish highlights on the top. So let's remove that. So I'll go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. Okay, so here I'm going to go and drag this slider down to reduce the saturation. Maybe to something like this. Okay. And now we still have some color, but it's less visible. Now the next thing I like to do to AO maps generated with nDo is to apply some filters to them. So let's go and let's have a look at what kind of cool effects we can achieve. So I'll go to Filter, Filter Gallery, and I'll go and use Paint Daubs. Now this filter is quite cool. By default, I don't really like the way it looks, but if you go and change its settings, so let's say let's change the brush type to white blurry, our AO map will become a lot more soft, but right now we've got those odd artifacts. So what we're gonna do is I'll go and reduce the sharpness setting down to 0. Okay, now everything will look a lot more cleaner. Right, so now we've got this very soft look going on, but maybe let's increase the brush size to 10. And yeah, that makes it look very, very smooth. And we've got those very large shapes going on. Alright, yeah, now let's click OK. And now let's zoom in. And maybe let's go and let's drop the opacity of this layer maybe down to 50. And as you can see, this makes this whole effect more subtle. So we've got some nice smooth gradients going on in at the edges. Okay everyone, so we're almost done here, but before we finish, let's maybe go and let's tweak one thing. So as you can see here, the color of this glass on the door windows is slightly darker than the one on the top, and that's because this area of the AO sharp layer is slightly darker. So let's remove that. So I'm gonna go and select the glass layer, and I'll make a selection. And now I'll go and remove those top windows from the selection. So I'll simply press Alt and drag my marquee tool. Okay. Now I'll go to the AO sharp layer, and I'll simply go and press this mask button to create a mask. Now let's go and select the mask. Okay, and go to Image, Adjustments, and click Invert. And now as you can see, both windows have the same color. Okay, so we're pretty much done here, and at this point we're going to leave the cavity map alone, and we're going to use that later. Now before we move on to the next step, let's go and let's preview what we've got so far in nDo. So let's open the nDo, and now let's go and let's open up our normal map. And now we have to go and right click on the previewer, and we have to go and click this bind icon here to bind it to our image. Right, now let's go and do the same with the diffuse. Okay, now we can see our diffuse. So basically, thanks to spending this time on creating the basic colors, now we can get an idea of what our final texture will look like. So now we can move on and we can start adding some details. And the first thing we're going to do is we'll add some large scale values.